God's foreknowledge of all things? So what we'll do is we'll look at a few different passages and we'll ask some questions and have some discussion around those passages. And we'll also invite Dan to join us for some further insights as well. The first passage that we're going to be looking at is in the Old Testament. And we read the words that were written by the prophet Isaiah in this passage. Isaiah chapter 46, starting at verse 9, says this: "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." So based upon this passage, we have a question for each of you. According to the passage, what makes God unique? Now, in the previous chapter, as we're getting those coming into the chat, in the previous chapter of Isaiah, in chapter 45, there's multiple times where God emphasizes that he alone is God and that there is no other God next to him. And many nations made up their own gods and they worshiped them, and they were all just imaginary. In fact, the 46th chapter of Isaiah begins with a description of those other gods. And the irony is that they were designed and fashioned by human beings who then turned and worshiped them, which seems a little strange. So we see here, yeah, we have some answers coming in. He knows the end from the beginning. Thank you, Kath. We have foreknowledge. He declares all things from the beginning of time till the end of time. And once again, Miriam, he knows the end from the beginning. Yeah, same thing. Ashley and Karen are really tied into the exact same response there. So very good answers. And I think it's important to also understand that Paul reflects on this exact same thing in his letter to the Romans, where he talks about the one true God who is able to talk about things that haven't even happened yet as if they were already happening. So Dan, just a question for you. Can you maybe give us some examples of this power of God who is able to call things before they actually happen?
Oh man, yeah, I don't even know where to start. There's so many examples of God doing that, and it's really what sets him apart, as you said, from the other gods. I think one thing that comes to mind is perhaps God warning the world that there would be a flood. It was something new. It was something unheard of. Think of Noah being warned, and he told him about this 120 years in advance. Moving on a little bit, you think about Abraham. He was told he would inherit Canaan, but then God gives him a dream, and he says, "You know what? Your family's gonna go down into Egypt first, and they'd be slaves there until a deliverer appears." You can sort of see how God in these examples is giving them outlines of the history that's going to take place. And I think the one I love the most is that after they end up in Babylon, they're going to be coming back to the land of Israel. And God predicted that there would be a Persian king named Cyrus who would tell them to go back and to build the temple and give them, all the things that they needed to do that. And he actually tells Isaiah that 150 years before it happens. And he tells Isaiah the king's name is going to be Cyrus. So, there's so many, and I don't know. Can I do one more?
Yeah, go for it.
there-
Yeah.
the one that's most historically impressive is God revealing to Daniel the details of four world empires that would dominate the entire earth, well, the centralized habited part of the earth for 1,000 years. Babylon, Medo-Persia by name, and then Greece and Rome by their characteristics. God knows it. God knows what's going to happen. He's the one making it happen, and he can tell us that. That's an example of his foreknowledge.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Dan. And it's exciting. It's exciting to know these things and to understand that God has a plan and that he does know that beginning from the end. So thank you for that. Our next set of verses, they're going to be in the New Testament. And we're going to really focus in on God's foreknowledge of Jesus, which we talked about already this evening. In John 17, verses 1 and then 4 and 5, we read this. These words spake Jesus, and lifted up his eyes to heaven, and said, Father, the hour is come. Glorify thy Son, that thy Son also may glorify thee. And then jumping down to verse 4, I have glorified thee on the earth. I have finished the work which thou gavest me to do. And now, O Father, glorify thou me with thine own self, with the glory which I had with thee before the world was. And so a question that we have for each of you tuning in today is, what event was soon going to take place that would glorify Jesus? Again, please type your answers in the chat. And it's interesting to note, as we're thinking about that the glory was going both ways. You see, Jesus had glorified God by doing God's will, and as a result of this obedience, God would also glorify Jesus. And the way that that worked is twofold. In fact, the very next verse of John talks about how Jesus manifested God's name. In other words, throughout his entire life, when people looked at Jesus, they actually saw a mirror of the character of God. And so, of course, then we're able to see that because of that, there is a promise that God would glorify Jesus as well. And the answers that we see in the chat here are spot on as well. Yeah, we have his resurrection. We have the death and resurrection. Denise as well. Jesus would rise from the dead in resurrection. Gary and Amy, thank you. His death and resurrection and subsequent glorification to the right hand of God. Yeah, that really encapsulates the entirety of it all, doesn't it? With being glorified and glorying his God and our God as well. And it's important to note, of course, yeah, and thank you, Karen, as well. It's important to note that all of this had to happen in order for Jesus to fulfill our Heavenly Father's purpose. So, Dan, we've come to these verses because of the references to Jesus having this glory before the world began. Does that imply that Jesus was with God before the world was created?
Yeah, it's a difficult statement. People come to that with that thinking they're going to see that, but I think it's helpful to think of an analogy. So we've already seen that God knows everything from the beginning, but maybe it's useful to picture like a grand building project. Maybe you're building a new stadium and you've got this, this architect who's got this vision in their mind. Well, that's kind of how it is with God. God has a vision of what he's going to do. But the architect, before they actually start building the building, well, he's going to put down on paper all the plans for what it's going to look like, and he's going to share that plans with other people and all the people that make decisions, and they can start to get an idea of what that vision is of how glorious this building or stadium is going to be. So a long time before things are prepared, it's sketched out. It's in the mind of the creator, and I think God is like that architect. And Jesus is relating to us that God had a plan that would fill this earth with his glory from the moment that he created the earth, and that Jesus is the centerpiece of that. And he's saying, let's do that. Let's go on to that next step and make this happen. And this relates, of course, to God's foreknowledge. What I like, though, is if you want to just put up on the screen Revelation 13, verse 8, you can see here that Jesus even talks about his death as happening before the foundation of the world. Jesus died 2,000 years ago. The earth was created much, much before that. And so what Jesus is saying is that in God's mind, he knew that Jesus was going to have to die. It was in his mind. And we see evidence of that in Jesus giving the Passover to the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. And this lamb typifies what Jesus would do. And what I like too is another passage. If you start looking at this theme of the foundation of the world in Ephesians chapter 1, we find out that God has also chosen us potentially before the foundation of the world. So he's not saying that we existed before we existed. He's saying that we too were in the knowledge of God, that God knew not only was he going to send his son, but there was going to be a great multitude of people that would be part of his plan. So this, this verse in John 17 isn't unique. You can see this phrase show up elsewhere in the Bible and start to understand it by looking at all the passages.
Ah, that's very cool. And it's exciting. I think I said exciting about the last one too, but it's it's exciting to know that we're part of God's plan and that he was thinking of us from years and years and years ago. And maybe even a little scary at times, but still a wonderful thing to understand. And I think that really brings us to our final verse for the evening, which is in Acts chapter 15. It's verse 18. It reads this: known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world. And as we reflect on this verse, we're going to ask another question for the audience. What about this verse is reassuring for you? You know, James was speaking in this verse, and please go ahead and put your responses in the chat for this as well. And I think it's important to note that James was speaking in this verse during a church meeting that was taking place in Jerusalem. And the leaders of the church were trying to figure out how to include the Gentiles in the Jewish hope. And they looked to the Old Testament and they found passages like passages in Genesis that actually, Dan, you referred to a little bit earlier, and then also in Amos as well in the prophets that explained that God wanted all people to be part of the gospel because God knew that there were some people in the Gentile nations that would believe, just like the believers that were Jews. And so we see, yeah, as Kath put into the chat there, God is totally in control. And with that, there we go. Thank you, Gary and Amy, as well. God is directing the affairs of men to bring about his plan that existed from the beginning. Yeah, and Miriam adds in that there was that purpose with his creation. And of course, as you mentioned, Dan, and as we're seeing in the chat, that was from the beginning. And definitely, Karen, yeah, God knows all. So thank you for that. And Denise, thank you for yours as well. If we were baptized, we would be heirs to the promises made to Abraham. Yeah, that's quoted in Galatians, actually. So thank you for that. Ashley, interesting here. Yeah, sometimes everything seems to be out of control, and one wonders if God is even working in the world, in it. But this verse is really comforting. He knows everything that will happen from the beginning. Yeah, and maybe some of us are feeling like we're living in times of chaos, that things are going just absolutely hectic everywhere around us. But we can feel confident and we can find comfort that God is in control and that he knows what will happen at the end. So, Dan, this brings up a final question for you. A lot of the concepts that we've looked at this evening speak of God knowing his plan from the beginning or from the foundation of the world. Of course, God knew the big picture from the beginning, and we've seen a bunch of his plans fulfilled, even as you brought out when you were referencing Daniel. We've seen those nations come to pass, and we've seen other things like Cyrus being brought into the scene as well. Are there any parts of God's plan that have yet to be fulfilled?
Yeah, you throw me these big questions with potential for long answers, but it's a beautiful question because as some of the people have typed in, to know that God is in control is really reassuring. But it also tells us that God has a plan and something else is going to be done. And there's a ton of ways to answer, but if I was just to put up a verse from Matthew chapter 25, and the reason I picked this verse is you can see I found it when I was looking at that theme of from the foundation of the world. So there's things that have already happened that God had planned from the foundation of the world. But look at this one in Matthew 25. He's actually telling people this is after he's judged between the sheep and the goats. So this is after Jesus has returned to the earth and there's a judgment that takes place. He says to those on the right hand, those that are found faithful, "Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." So there's this kingdom that says has been prepared from the foundation of the world. And this kingdom didn't exist, many thousands of years ago. It doesn't exist now. Jesus is speaking in the context of coming back and giving this to those who are faithful. And so the idea is that this kingdom has also been in the mind of God from before creation. And we know the kingdom's going to be on earth. We know Jesus is going to be ruler. We know there's going to be peace. We know it hasn't happened. And so we know, just like the other things happened, like Jesus came and gave his life, that this is also going to happen because it's in the mind of God. It's incredible. There's promise exists, and like you said before, you can sort of see our place in it, that God has chosen us to be part of it. I guess if we want to be, if we don't want to walk away like the Jews did from the marvelous teaching of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that, Dan. And it's nice to know that uh, we have to take some ownership in this. God has a plan, and it's up to us to
Mhm.
either be a part of that by the way that we live and by the things that we put into our mind and in our hearts, or we can choose to not be a part of it. And hopefully all of us make the right choice, not just today, but each day as we wait for God's plan to finally come to pass in its completeness. It'll be a wonderful time when the glory of God will cover this earth. It's an exciting thing to think about, because as we read in the chat, even with some of the responses, it's definitely not the case right now. So as we've looked this evening, first of all, again, thank you very much, Dan, for your insights and for your words, for your answers, of course, for joining us tonight. And I think we could just put in summary these 5 statements. First of all, we saw that Jesus was greater than Abraham, Solomon, and the prophets. And we saw that Jesus did not claim that he was God, nor did he pre-exist before his birth. We saw that God had a plan from the beginning, and that plan was that Jesus would be the Messiah. And we also saw that the word in John is the plan and purpose that God had from the beginning, because God knows all things, both from the beginning to the end. And of course, he provides us with a hope that we can be part of all of those things as his plan does get fulfilled.